Welcome to What's on Your Bookshelf with your hosts, Denise Russo and Samantha Powell.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of What's on Your Bookshelf. This is a leadership and self-development podcast where we're exploring our passions, lifting the lids on our potential, and getting closer to our sense of purpose by looking at the lessons we're learning through reading books that are on our bookshelves. The book we're exploring together is Coach Wooden by Pat Williams. This is an ongoing podcast on this book, which is 7 principles that shaped his life and will change yours. We're up to principle number 4 now, which is drinking deeply from good books, especially the Bible. And this is part 2 of the first episode. Now, if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, that's okay. You don't need to listen to the past ones to get value from the current ones, but we sure would love for you to go back, subscribe, share, and you can comment and communicate with us through our LinkedIn page, which is called School of Thoughts Publishing. I'm once again today joined by my very good friend, Sam Powell, who runs the coaching organization called Lead the Game, and we're so excited to dive into part 2 of this book. 10 tips for more effective reading is where we're going to kick it off. What I loved about this one, Sam, as we get started, is that this particular part of the chapter first started with Pat Williams mentioning our good friend, Don Yeager, who is a teacher for John Maxwell, but also a very accomplished author and was a writer for Sports Illustrated for many years and was actually interviewed by Andy and myself recently on our podcast. And what Pat Williams says is that Don Yeager was one of Coach Wooden's writing partners for a book called A Game Plan for Life. Don also was mentored by Coach Wooden, and I'm not sure if Don introduced John Maxwell to John Wooden, possibly, but there's definitely a 6 degrees of separation that's much less than 6 for all of their relationship with Coach Wooden. And Don had once told Pat that he looked around the thousands of books in Coach Wooden's library and asked him, how many of those books have you actually read? And he told Don about 75% of them. Now that he's at age 99, well, at the time of the book writing, his granddaughter would read the books to him. And even though he couldn't read anymore himself, he still loved books. And he was raised to love books. And that all started with his dad reading to him as a young boy. So I can't wait to jump in, Sam, and talk about what are the 10 tips for more effective reading that Pat outlines in the book here.
Yeah, this will be an interesting one, right? So we had talked in the part 1 of this episode and this principle about drinking deeply from good books about why people would want to read and what that looks like. And we mentioned that, sometimes there's a lot of people who don't read very often. And so sometimes it's really hard. It's really intimidating to think about reading. So we talked about, how to make that a little easier last time, free resources from the library and various things. But Pat lays out 10 really practical things for the drinking deeply part, right? It's one thing to read a book, but it's another thing to really soak that in. And he kicks this section of this chapter off by saying, Coach Wooden was raised with a love of books, and he has always been able to get more out of books than any other human being I know. And so Pat's going to share with us his 10 tips for reading books that'll help you become a more effective reader. And so these are super interesting. So we'll just hop right into these. The first one is schedule a daily reading time, preferably an hour a day or more. I read a lot. I don't schedule reading time. Do you? Do you have a scheduled set time that you read?
I don't have a set time, but I have sort of a flow to my day. So in the morning, when I come into my office, the very first thing I do is I have these 2 devotionals that are sitting right by my screen that are devotionals that are called Jesus Calling devotionals. They're kind of on these little calendar flip pages. So there's 2 paragraphs is all. And so I love starting my day by these. And these are by Sarah Young, author Sarah Young. So I start by reading those, and then I dive deeper because each of those 2 paragraphs take you deeper into different verses that are in the Bible. And so that's how I start my day every day. I also do journaling in the morning before I get started. So I not only am reading, but I'm also writing. And at the end of the day, I love to be able to read to settle my mind. Now, I will say I've suddenly been caught up with some television shows, and I've never been a television person ever. But since I have a lot more time on my hands, my kids thought it would be fun to get me into some TV shows. So if I am too tired in my eyes to read at night, then I might put on my indulgence, which is probably similar to your fan of fiction books, is I've become a fan of some television shows. And so I might watch an episode before I go to sleep.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I have one of those flip calendars. Mine's inspirational quotes, and it's a good way to, like, it's, for me, it's like usually a sentence or so, but a nice little way to kind of kick off the day. But I don't schedule time, and I wouldn't say I even have a great routine, which is something I would love to get better on. It's one of my improvement areas of my life. I have more like associations, like, I don't know, when I'm doing one thing, I go to pick up my phone to just scroll through social media or whatever. Like, instead of that, I end up going into my Kindle app and reading a little bit. So for me, it's less of time and more of, I don't know, like when doing something that doesn't require focus, or like when waiting for something, or like when I go to the baseball field 45 minutes early because we drive together as a family, and my husband and son are warming up while I read a book. So, I do more associative, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I spent a lot of time on soccer fields, so I know what you're talking about, Mama.
Yeah.
I had a whole backpack full of magazines and things like that. So I might have, say, like a cooking magazine or a health magazine, or even an HBR, Harvard Business Review magazine. And depending on how I felt, I would decide what I was going to read. But so I agree with you that I don't necessarily schedule time, but there are definite times in every day where I spend that time, or let me rephrase and say invest that time reading. How about number 2? What's number 2?
Be a discriminating reader. So when you purchase a book, you make a financial investment. When you read it, you invest in something more precious than money, your time and your life, which is what you just said. Good job. So discriminating reader, right? You are spending time on things. Have you ever started a book and just not finished it because you decided it wasn't worth the investment?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Like I said on the last episode, I have more than 100 books that I recently took off my shelf. Most of them I read all the way through, but some of them were books where I just thought, that's not a book that I'm going to resonate with. And so I took that one off too. The ones that are left on the shelf, there's still several hundred there, but these are either all ones that are my go-to, have to be on the shelf books, or they're ones where I've said, okay, if I only have a limited time left in my life, if I really wanted to read any books left, what are they? The sad thing is people are writing books constantly. And so I still have a long Amazon wish list. I hope that Santa is nice to me this year because I have a lot in the cart.
Yeah. And I like the recommendation in this section of, asking for reading recommendations from people whose opinions you trust, right? So talking about books with people, and knowing who likes to read what. So it's like, if I wanted a book on self-help, self-improvement, leadership, I'd come to you and be like, just give me a book. Tell me what's on the shelf, right? Yes. Whereas like I have other friends who, read other types of things, and it's like, hey, I'm looking for something here or whatever. But I love the part that says, whenever you're introduced to someone new, here's a great conversation starter. What books are you reading? Who's your favorite author? Like, I've never once started, I read a lot, and I've never had a conversation like that while getting to know somebody, or just, making small talk. But I think I'm going to add that in, because that would be a new way for me to find some other reading friends, and also find, some interesting stuff. Also might be a little awkward sometimes asking that. So I have to find my moments. I got to test it out, see how it goes.
Yeah. Well, that's how this podcast started. This podcast started because I had a column in a magazine that I created, a leadership development magazine. And the column was called What's on Your Bookshelf, because people would often come to me and say, well, what's a book you can recommend for this topic? Or I'm going through this. What's a book that can help me with that? Or what book are you reading? And so the column grew out of that. And this podcast then grew out of that. And a lot of the books that are on my bookshelf are either books that I thought sounded interesting, or they indeed were also recommended to me from other people.
I read that column every time that magazine came out, and yeah, I always added to my list from that book, or really thought about the books that had come out that that I had already read about that, and I was like, oh, I love that one too, and
Yeah.
rethinking about some of what I had learned from there. But yeah, I don't know. To
I
be part of being a discriminating reader is knowing who
yeah.
to get good recommendations from.
Who to get good recommendations for. I would love to know what our listeners are reading. And so
Yeah,
if
be
you're
interested.
listening, share that with us, right? We have a LinkedIn page. It's called School of Thoughts Publishing, but it'd be really cool to see what's on their bookshelf. So this is what's
Uh-huh.
on our bookshelf. And we're talking about a book today that's on our bookshelf. And these are the 10 tips that Pat Williams has about better reading habits. And so I would love to know what other people are reading. Share that with us in School of Thoughts Publishing. And maybe the books on your bookshelf will become on ours and maybe even make it onto our podcast. In fact, I had a few people in the last 2 weeks reach out to me, Sam, that have said, what would it take for me to get on your podcast and talk about the books that are on my bookshelf?
Fun. I'd love that.
Yeah.
I'd love to have some friends come chat,
Yeah.
and I don't know. Like I said, I'd love some recommendations from people we know and we trust for good stuff.
Let's go to the third one because you and I actually just
Uh-huh.
talked about this with our habits on the ball fields.
Yeah, keep number 3 is keep books handy wherever you are. And I think that, like, to me, this is so easy now because of the apps, because of, whatever. Like, I have the Amazon Kindle app. I do a Kindle Unlimited subscription, so I can download as kind of an infinite number of free books and borrow them in and out. And then I've got the Libby app, the Hoopla app, which are both connected to my library and my library card. So for me, I don't have to carry anything with me. All I need is my phone, or I have one of those Kindle Paperwhite things for when, my eyes hurt and I'm trying to put my phone away. And it's easy, right? It's so easy to have books with you. I mean, my Harvard Business Review, the magazine, I think, you mentioned carrying that with you. I've got that app. So I do get the print magazine, but most of the time, by the time that's come to me, I've already read through the articles on the app. And, same thing, like going to websites of publications and stuff like that, like so easy to do that. And it's funny, this part also reminded me of something I heard John Maxwell say recently in a training I was doing, where he was talking about having the books that you reference a lot, right? The books that you really drink deeply from at hand, right? Like on your bookshelf and marked, right? Like put your tabs in there, highlight the sections that you go back to all the time, or that you're like, oh, I need to, I might reference this quite a bit. And so that's the other thing about keeping books handy where you are, is not only is it easy in today's world from, apps and phones and things like that, but also purposefully when you do have the print copies of books, because I do like to especially the ones where I'm learning something, the nonfictions, I like to have those in print because I like to write and highlight and put a little tab in them. And I know you do that a lot with your books.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I turned the pages. I put these little, you can't see if we're not doing a video today, but I've got these little tabs on pages. I've got Post-it notes on the pages. I have highlighter marks on all of the pages. And I used to not be that person. I write in the margins. I used to be the person that wanted all my books to look pretty on the shelf, like they were for decoration or something. And in fact, what's so funny about that, part of the books that I took off the bookshelf I was just telling you about, I would buy 2 copies of books sometimes, like especially when I was teaching leadership development. There was one where I would just mark it up and write in things I wanted to say to a class or something like that. But there would be the other one that I just wanted to be fresh and new on the shelf. And as I was looking through, I thought to myself, why in the world am I keeping 2 books? The one I want is the one I've lived in, not the one that I'd have to reread and try to live through again in a new way. And so I love to be able to write through my books. And in fact, Bill Bennet, who's from UCLA, he told Pat that he learned from Coach Wooden that life is about continuous learning. And if you're not learning, you're not living. And what I loved so much about that quote, Sam, is that I often would say this: when I was teaching leadership development previously, and even being a people leader, is that if you are a leader and you think you're done learning, then you're not a leader. You may be a manager, and I'm not even sure if you're a good one at that. Continuous learning is the purpose of life. And even John Maxwell, referencing back to him, he was saying in a recent conference we were at, he's in his late 70s, and he said he's still learning every day and reading things and listening to people and drinking deeply from good books. And here's a man who has written over 100 best-selling books himself, and yet he's still reading from and learning from other books.
Yeah, and I love that. There's the little call out in this part of the book that says, it is what you learn after you know it all that counts. And I love that, right? Like just stretching that little bit more and, and keeping those books really handy. Go back, go drink deeply. But you just said something that was, I forget exactly what you just said, but like live it, like the copy of the book you wanted to keep was the one that you had really like lived in. And that's number 4 is don't just read books, interact with them. And the thing I have highlighted here is Roykoff Press founder Elbert Hubbard said, I do not read a book. I hold a conversation with the author. And I love that. I feel like we're not talking to Pat here right now, but I feel like we're holding a conversation with him as we dive so deeply and drink so deeply from this book.
I love that because I have often wondered, now that we're halfway through the book, like what was Pat Williams thinking when he was learning from Coach Wooden, or when he was interviewing all these players and coaches, or when he was talking to his friend Don Yeager, or even in his own leadership, because he's a very successful leader in the sports and business world as well. Like, what was he thinking when he was putting these things? Because thoughts become things, and these things that we get to read become part of our life as well. I agree with you that if you can interact with books, one of the things we talked about in a previous episode, which was, I've already read this book before we joined this book into our podcast, but I've never lived out loud this book as much as we've done together by really page by page diving into what does it really mean to drink deeply? What does it really mean to make each day that you live a masterpiece? What does it really mean to be true to yourself? And so I've loved going through this process together. It will take us forever to go through all the books on our bookshelves, but going through books in this way have made so much more impact than just reading it for the sake of reading it and saying, oh, I read that book.
Yeah, absolutely right. It really brings it to life. It really is an interaction with them. And then the other thing I think you were talking about, right, with all the books that you've got, you had your 2 copies, right? So when you said that sentence, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the next two things here. So, that you're keeping the marked up copy because you're not just reading the book, you're interacting with it. But the fancy copy was tip number 5 here, which is furnish your home with good books. And same thing I would keep, when I had an office in a building pre-COVID, all that sort of good stuff, was I would keep all my my key books on a shelf in my office that people could see. So when people came in to talk to me, that was there. And 1, so I could go back to number 3 and keep them handy wherever I needed them. But it was also to furnish, like it was part of the furnishing, it was part of the decoration, because 1, it helps remind you, but 2, you can then turn around and recommend it to people too.
This is so funny because last week, I think I was telling you, I met one of my cousins for the first time. We went to Disney World. He actually works at Disney World, which is amazing. But he was telling me, it was so funny. He went to a book sale that was only open to the cast members at Disney, and they were getting these amazing books for like 50 cents. And so he was showing me these books that he's going to have on display on this bookshelf to be like his decoration in his house. And I said, oh my gosh, Jeff, are you going to read that book? That's a great book. And he said, no, it's just the color of the binding is going to go well with my furnishings. And I thought, oh my gosh, these are amazing books you're getting for 50 cents or $1 that I have lived in these books. And this chapter is so interesting because it says your own books belong to you. You treat them with that affectionate intimacy that annihilates formality. Books are for use, not for show. You should own no book that you are afraid to mark up or afraid to place on the table wide open and face down. But I'll say this. I still love the idea of having books for decoration because there are some books on my shelf that are there because they just look good.
They look
But
pretty. Uh-huh.
they look good. In fact, when I was years ago, my house was destroyed in a federal declared disaster in a flood, and I'm not a big fiction reader, but my favorite fiction author is John Grisham. I have every single one of his books. Well, I had every single one of his books in hardcover before my flood, and they all got destroyed. They went underwater and were completely destroyed. My mom ended up writing to John Grisham's publishing company and told them what happened.
Oh.
And John Grisham sent me the full library back because of what happened. And so those books are on my bookshelf in my new house. And I promise you, they will stay there front and center. And they are likely not going to get marked up because there's like a purpose behind why those are on my bookshelf. But every new book that he's written since I got those books, you can rest assured if you cracked them open, you'll see all kinds of markings. He's my definite favorite fiction author, John Grisham.
Yeah, I love that. And this tip ends, and I loved this quote, is that novelist and playwright Robertson Davies once observed, a truly great book should be read in youth, again in maturity, and once more in old age, as a fine building should be seen by morning light, at noon, and by midnight.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that, right? When you've furnished your life with books, when you've got them all around you, you can go back to them, right?
Yes.
You can pick them back up. You can get back in that story, travel back to that time, go be that, life you won't ever get to live, right? To go learn that lesson again, to go, sit at the feet of that mentor one more time. And I love that thought process of reading them through the different stages of life, right? I think the book I said last time that is one of my favorites I keep going back to is The Phantom Tollbooth. And that's it, right? Like reading it through those different stages, I pick up something new and different. And it's a children's book, but, there's something really, really interesting to doing that. And I love that thought process.
I love that too. One of the other things he says before section 6 is fine books are worth keeping and rereading again and again throughout our lives. I think for me, one of my favorite books on my bookshelf that I do that with is The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins.
Oh, yeah. I've read that a bunch of times. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Like every time you got a new promotion, you could go back to it,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And even though it's practical, it's like becomes new again because you're in a new situation, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And then we did a deep dive with that on one of the teams you and I were on. Somebody one of our friends led us through a deep dive exploration. It was really good. And again, like I had read the book multiple times and used it through multiple transitions, and it was fresh and new, and it was at a different stage in my career, a different level of maturity, a different level of experience. And I was so thankful that we did that and that we invested the time and we did the deep dive because, yeah, that one. And I recommend that book to everybody all the time as soon as they go through it. And I don't know how many times I've had people join teams, or I'd hire somebody, they come onto the team, and I quote parts of that book. I was like, listen, you're not promoting yourself in your mind, in your brain. You're not doing, you're not taking one of these key steps. And I was like, if you want to dive deep, read the book.
Read the book.
Here's my copy, borrow it. I had like 3 different copies at one point. And yeah, they're all marked up.
That's the power of, like you're saying too, of if you dive deeply yourself, there's a lot more power when you're doing it with a group of people. And there is a tremendous impact when you're doing it with a great facilitator. So Rachel is the number one facilitator of that book, The First 90 Days. She's brought it to life. I've listened to that book and her teach it, I don't know, a dozen times. And every time she does, I learn something new from it, for sure.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great one. I can't believe we haven't have we talked about that one at all yet in this book? I feel like it had to have come up, but I don't think it has.
No.
Oh, crazy. All right. So number 6 here is set aside a portion of your vacation for a reading sabbatical. Do you do that?
I absolutely bring books with me wherever I am on vacation. Absolutely. In fact, I mentioned on the last episode that we had that my son brought a book on a vacation once on a spring break by John Pearson called Learn Me Good. And there's a second follow-on book called Learn Me Gooder. If you ever want to just have a break from life and laugh until your sides hurt. You have to get this book. It's hilarious. He writes about being a rookie teacher when he became a school teacher. It is one of the most funny books I've ever read. And my son was reading it. He was young at the time, like in elementary school, even when he bought the book, and he was reading it on the Kindle. And he was sitting there, not playing a video game, not playing with friends, and he was cracking up. So I had to know, what is he reading? Which is just the great power in also asking people what's resonating with them and what are they reading. But it was a great way to escape. For me on vacation, I often will bring a book on an airplane rides. Okay. On an airplane ride, I'll usually have like a book I want to read for relaxation and a book I want to read to learn. And based on how I feel and how long the flight is, depends on what I'm actually reading.
Yep, I do the exact same thing. And I also try to find like a series on the fun side of it, and I download them all on my Kindle so that like I can just binge them. And my parents live overseas, so I end up taking really long flights to go visit them. And so I'm like, all right, I bet I can get through this entire series. Yes. And then I always have the, learning book off to the side ready to go too, depending on, I don't know, whatever mood strikes me at the time. But yeah. I think a lot of people do that. I think that's where a lot of people just read is on vacation, right? I'll take a book to the beach or, I hear a million people say that all the time. And yeah, that's it's a good time to do it. And especially when you're taking that time away to rest your brain from your day-to-day routine. It's often a really great time to get that inspiration and get to that level of being able to drink a little bit deeper because your brain's a little clearer.
I agree with you 100% on that. Well, we are living out loud number 7. What's number 7?
We sure are. I laughed at this one when I read it, but share your reading experiences with other enthusiastic readers. Yep, we are doing that here. And we've talked about this, I think, quite a bit. We talked about it in the last episode, talked about it here, but I mean, find the people, talk about it, tell them what you're reading, and then, they'll come and tell you what they're reading. And it's where you learn in that, right? There's community in that. And that's what helps us feel connected to, something bigger than ourselves. So it's lovely.
What I love about this one, too, is it talks about something that we shared last episode, which was join book discussion clubs or just explore books with other people, which we've talked about joining cohorts. A reminder for those who maybe haven't listened to the past episode is there are easy ways to get engaged. I am in a book club with my library with virtual readers. We talked about having an opportunity that if you're listening and you want to have a book club with your coworkers and you need a master facilitator, reach out to us at our School of Thoughts Publishing LinkedIn page, and we will link you up with master facilitators, if not even ourselves, to walk you through the books that maybe are on our bookshelves or books that you're reading as well. But going through books with other people, there's just some extra power in being able to explore that with someone. Like you even said with the Michael Watkins First 90 Days, reading it together with a group just brings it to life sometimes in a different way.
Yeah, and I think that like lends itself to number 8 here, which is use what you learn, right? When you're sharing your experiences with other people, it kind of naturally lends you to not just reading, right? I haven't just intake like the information. I'm also processing it and pushing it back out, right? I'm sharing what I learn. And this is really this is so much of what we've been doing in this exploration of this book is talking about using what we're learning. What do we think about it? What does that do? And, this was actually kind of a longer section in this book because I think that this is so important. And this is something that John was really known for, right? Not only, this isn't just read a bunch of books, this is drink deeply from books. And he lived this and really used what he learned.
Yes. Yeah. There was this Swen Nader, who was a former UCLA center that played for Coach Wooden, said that some people read without any sense of purpose, but that wasn't Coach Wooden. Coach Wooden always read books that he thought would improve his life in some way that would make him a better person. And then he would take what he learned and he would teach it to others. And even though we never had a chance, Sam, to meet Coach Wooden and even be able to, at this point yet, talk to Pat Williams, I feel like we've been able to do that, is to take these things that both of them have learned, that they're teaching us, that we're able to now use this podcast and platform to teach others. But you have to keep using what you've learned, is what the end of that principle says.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a part that says sometimes people say, I can never remember a joke. Well, that's because they never tell it. If you tell a joke over and over again, you remember it. And I always
Mm-hmm.
tell that to people when they're on like a development plan or learning. Part of your growth plan, your development plan should be about you teaching whatever it is you are trying to learn to somebody else, mentoring somebody, coaching somebody else, teaching a lesson somewhere, because in that processing, in taking it in, processing it, internalizing it, and then putting it back out in the world in some
Mm-hmm.
form, you're really mastering whatever that skill is. And so, it's not just the learning, it's not just the sitting in it, it's that turning it back around and utilizing it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think in teaching is where we often really solidify our mastery or really have that breakthrough. I was talking to somebody yesterday who said she was mentoring another leader in a certain area, and she like gave her this light bulb moment of, oh my gosh, I actually know so much in this one space. And it was only in teaching somebody else and helping somebody who's, a few years behind her in their career, these same skills that she already has mastered, and in teaching them, she's actually relearning or, deepening that knowledge. And, I think that's what I love about this, tip number 8 here.
That's really great. To me, what that says is see it, say it, do it. So you read
Mhm.
it, you express what you've read, and then you live it out
Mm,
loud. And that's the part of
yeah.
even what John Maxwell's book, Intentional Living, is all about, which is
Mhm.
taking the things that you're learning, but doing something about it. And so
Yeah.
for me, that's what this number 8 means to me. How about number 9?
Yeah. Widen your reading horizons is tip number 9. So you've got a pretty wide, wide and deep bookshelf. Like, how do you widen your horizons? How do you keep finding new things to read or different things to read?
That's a really good question because I've recently just become more of a fan of reading fiction books. I told you John Grisham is my favorite fiction author, but I really kind of stuck to him for a long time. And now that I have a little bit more time on my hands, how I'm widening my reading horizons is looking at what are other people reading. So I have a friend who I don't remember, was it this episode or the last one, because they seem to blend together, but my friend who reads books and then puts them in her own little library in her like mailbox to give away.
Mhm.
And so I'll often look and say, what is Jenny reading? And I think that's something that I want to check out or read. Or I'll have other people that'll say
Yeah.
in their Facebook posts, like, this is something I'm reading at the beach, like you said, and I'll go grab that. Or I like to sometimes go walk around, and at Target, they'll have like one shelf where you can see some of the top selling books, or even on Amazon, it'll say, if you read this, you might like that. So
Yep.
some of my
Yep.
books come from that. But this part of the chapter says the moral of the story is don't confine your reading to a narrow range of interests. Even though a lot of the books on my bookshelves are self-help or leadership development books, a lot of them have a really different spin. Everything from I've got books about Disney World on the shelf all the way to books about Dr. Seuss. I have books on the shelf that are written from famous authors and some that are written from athletes and were never authors until they wrote their first book. And I have books from experts and books that are not experts, but maybe just lived through some experience. So for me, not
Mhm.
confining reading to a narrow range of interests helps keep me fresh. And another way that I pick out different books is I like to listen to speakers talking about books they wrote. And if their speaking is interesting, I might buy a book. In fact, a book that's in my cart right now, I mentioned in the last episode, I think is called Love Plus Work by Marcus Buckingham. I haven't read it yet. It's in my cart, but I got interested in the book by listening to him talk about the book, which prompted me to want to buy the book.
Yeah, and I think too, like if you go back to you alluded to it, right? Sharing your tip number 7, sharing your reading experiences with other people and things like that. That's where so much recommendation comes from, is talking with other people. I also am in a couple of Facebook groups where, I find like a genre or something that I really like to read, and I join a group, and all it is people looking for recommendations on books. And like
Mm-hmm.
one of the ones I have has like more than 10,000 people in it. So it's just constant recommendations. It completely kills my to be read list because it just infinitely goes on. But I found some of my absolute favorite books from things like that, other people recommending stuff. And it's expanded, right? Like one thing leads to another, and all of a sudden I'm in some totally different genre than I started in because, kind of nuggets lead you across the board here.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
What's our next one here?
This is tip number 10. It's the very last one, and I know this probably calls to your heart and to mine, but number 10 is encourage reading in others, especially the young. What do I know your kid, you've talked all about how your kids are readers and things like that. What did you think of when you read this last tip?
I really love this one as well because so Vincent is more of a likes to listen to TikTok and things like that as opposed to reading. But I recently bought him a couple books that I found at Goodwill, which you can buy some really great books secondhand if you have thrift shops wherever you live. And you can go to the library and get all the books for free, but you have to actually turn them back in. But sometimes libraries have really great book sales as well. And so my kids now are in college, both of them, but I've tried to instill in them the importance of reading, even just a little bit of it at a time. I mentioned that I think one of Vincent's favorite books is the book called Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. And my daughter, Olivia, she's just an avid reader. She reads a lot. So to pick out favorite books is challenging, but I wish I could remember. I don't have my phone in front of me to look it up, but one of her all-time favorite books, and I'm going to have to ask her what it was called exactly. It was a book about a mermaid, and in the back of the book, there was a locket like in the book. And so you could take the necklace out and wear the necklace. I must have read that book, I don't know, 10 billion times with her. And her name is Olivia. So she grew up loving the Olivia books that are about the little piggy.
Yeah.
And so we had all of those books. I'm a big Dr. Seuss fan. I think Dr. Seuss, by the way, is known as a children's book author, but you can get a lot of leadership lessons out of reading the books of Dr. Seuss.
True.
So, like kids are reading books, but you don't know what those words will do to their thoughts and impact their thinking throughout their life. And so it's important to read when you're young and get in the habit of reading, especially nowadays when kids are doing not a lot of reading, they're doing a lot of watching, and how important it is to just still dive into a great book and drink deeply from it.
Yeah, and this reminded me of my son is in second grade this year, and his teacher at the very beginning of the year sent us this little like informational flyer that was like it's titled "Why Can't I Skip My 20 Minutes of Reading Tonight?" Right? And so it is encouraging you to read with your children or have your child read for 20 minutes every day. And so it does this comparison of like what that adds up to, right? And I'm a math lover and I love anything that we get fun numbers on, but student A, who reads 20 minutes each day, reads 3,600 minutes in a school year, which is 1.8 million words in a school year. Student B, who only reads 5 minutes a day, reads 900 minutes in a school year, which is 282,000 words in a year. And student C, who reads 1 minute each day, reads 180 minutes each school year, which is 8,000 words. So reading 20 minutes a day as a kid can expose you to 1.8 million words in one school year. You think about the vocabulary you learn, you think about the lessons you're learning, and especially if you read with like an adult reading with a child, right? That time that you spend together, right? That's 36,000 minutes that you've spent with somebody. And it says by the end of sixth grade, student A, who's reading 20 minutes a day, will have read the equivalent of 60 whole school days, while student B, who only reads 5 minutes a day, will have read only 12 school days. So you're talking about by the time you get halfway through school, 60 entire school days of reading, as opposed to 12 if you read for 20 minutes a day versus 5. And so like for me, like with our son, when he was born, instead of cards at his baby shower, we asked people to give us books and just write their name in the book so that we knew who gave us what kids book. And we got a wide range, tons of Dr. Seuss, little, fun books for kids. But we read to him every night, even when he was a tiny, tiny baby, just read to him these books. And I mean, I would love to say he's like this magical reader right now. He's in the cool kid phase, but I have all faith we're going to come back around to it at some point here. But he reads. He loves reading. He reads at school. Like I said, he's carrying around his Derek Jeter book that we found his interest area. But think of the difference that makes in children's lives and what that sets you up for to be a lifelong reader, which is really what this chapter is about.
Super powerful. When you think about when people define success, a lot of times people define success by how much money you have, not by how much wisdom that you have. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting at the end of this chapter, there's two things that stood out to me, which is one is a story about a very successful businessman named Charlie. In fact, his name was Charlie Tremendous Jones. He actually retired when he was only 37 years old, became one of the top motivational speakers in the world. And he once wrote that you are the same today as you're going to be in 5 years, except for two things: the people you meet and the books that you read. And it goes on to say that read. A proper diet is good for your body, and the best books are good for your mind. And he talks about all the different kinds of books that he was reading. And he said God's greatest gift for our time on earth is his word. And this chapter is called Drink Deeply from Good Books, especially the Bible. And as I mentioned in the early part of the episode, that to me is the most important book that's on my bookshelf. And one of the things that the chapter ends with that I didn't notice before. Here's a book that's my favorite book. Every day that I read it, I learn something new and different about it. And it took me reading this John Wooden book to learn something I didn't know about this other book that is my most favorite book. And it's in the end of the chapter 5 that we're on, where it's talking about Paul. And Paul is the person that wrote most of the New Testament, or a good portion of the New Testament of the Bible. And at the end of his life, he was in prison in Rome, and it was cold. It was winter. He was facing an execution and having his head chopped off. And it says in the book of Timothy, which is a book in the Bible, that he was seeking consolation in only two things. The same thing that Charlie Tremendous Jones says. Number one, the companionship of his friends. And number two, the companionship of his books. And then Pat Williams goes on to just end the chapter by saying that books are our friends, and our best friend of all is the Bible. In its pages, we find not only insight and knowledge, but also comfort for the soul. Throughout your life, in the good times and the hard times, heed the counsel of Joshua Hugh Wooden to drink deeply from good books, especially the Bible. And just remembering that these were the principles that he taught his sons, who then went on to embrace and live out the lessons that he taught them. And they've gone on to teach others. In fact, Coach Wooden says in the book that most of his brothers became school teachers just like he did. And how many thousands of people have now been able to learn from him through the books that he read, that he learned from, that somebody else read to him. And some of these stories are thousands of years old.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that this chapter sort of ends in that thought process of, over and over again, right? The companions that come with us are the people around us and the books that we read, right? So the two things that we end with here, this chapter those are the two things. And the next principle in the next chapter we pick up is make friendship a fine art. And so we've just talked about this principle of drinking deeply from good books, but we're also going to talk about the fine art of friendship next time. And Andy's joining us again for that. So super excited to have him back from vacation. So I'm excited to talk with you. But how about accountability on this one? Where are you at? What are you bringing away?
So for this one, I think for this week, I recently was reading this article by a lady who's a coach. And she was talking about how at this particular time, she was super burnt out. She was mentally spent. And the way that she described it is that she said, "My life is gray. I found the door to the secret garden, but I cannot see the color of the flowers. I cannot smell their perfume. I cannot feel the warmth of the sun. I can sit under the giant oak tree, but feel no protection from the storm." And I thought, man, those are such powerful words. And this description of this lady who was just burnt out. And so for me, what it called to me was that there are some really great descriptors in my favorite book that I mentioned, the Bible, that talk about how to live a life in Technicolor. And so I think what I want to do over this next week is take what this lady was talking about as far as her experience of living a life that was gray and dark and that she couldn't see the color in the flowers. And I want to see some pages illuminate for me. In fact, I started doing that a little bit this morning. I want to flesh it out. I think I'll probably write a small blog on that on my Facebook page. But that's what I'm going to do this next week, is to look at these feelings this person had, to see how those feelings resonate with me and what I want to do about it, to actually take that with purpose and with passion and turn it upside down and look at the life being in Technicolor.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, that's really pretty. And I like, especially like thinking about this book too, and, making each day a masterpiece. And we're about to talk about the fine art of friendship. And I like that, bringing in that Technicolor into your life and exploring that. That's awesome. I think for me, I'm going to focus on number 10, and, it's summer season now with, with the kids. And so finding ways to make sure that my son engages in books and in reading, and not just all the million sports we have planned and the time at the pool.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Well, it's been fun being with you here yet again for this episode of What's on Your Bookshelf. And friends, if you haven't yet subscribed, please do that. Share this episode and others with your friends. We're on almost every platform, I believe, at this point now. We'd love to hear from you on our LinkedIn page, School of Thoughts Publishing. My name's Denise Russo. Thanks for being here with my friend Sam Powell. We'll look forward to talking to you next time on Making Friendship a Fine Art. Have a great day, everyone.